It is 6 p.m. in Tehran. A shopkeeper locks his doors. He isn't closing because he's out of stock. He's closing because the currency in his register is undergoing a violent evaporation. Every 24 hours, the rial loses 2% of its purchasing power. By the time he wakes up tomorrow, his day's work will be worth less than the paper it's printed on. To the rest of the world, Iran is a headline about drones, sanctions, and missiles. But on the ground, the war isn't happening on a map. It's happening in wallets. The civilian economy is in terminal decline, yet the military machine is running at full throttle. Welcome to ClearCurve. Think of the Iranian economy like a high-performance jet engine. To stay at altitude, it needs two things: fuel and constant maintenance. The fuel is oil revenue. The maintenance is infrastructure investment. Since the 2026 blockade began, the regime has stopped trying to fly the plane. Instead, they are stripping the wings to build missiles. They are cannibalizing the civilian sector to fuel the military nuclear complex. This isn't mismanagement. It is a deliberate, aggressive pivot. They have traded the standard of living for systemic endurance. But you cannot run an engine forever if you have stripped the casing to build the turbine. Eventually, the structural integrity fails, and the engine consumes itself. Take the $25 billion memorandum with Moscow. On the surface, it's marketed as energy security. In reality, it's a sovereignty for survival trade. Iran is embedding its power grid and nuclear program into Russian infrastructure. Look closer at the mechanics. This is a form of technical anchoring. By relying on Russian-grade nuclear technology and grid management, Iran has effectively outsourced the maintenance of its most critical infrastructure. It is a calculated, desperate risk. If Iran's energy grid becomes a Russian asset, the West cannot strike it without risking a direct military collision with Moscow. It is a cynical, cold-blooded defensive shield. But this shield comes at a brutal cost. With inflation hitting 83% point to point, that $25 billion isn't coming from a surplus. It is being carved out of the literal hunger of the population. They are sacrificing the internal foundation to reinforce the perimeter wall. The landscape shifted even further on May 1st. The United Arab Emirates' exit from OPEC shattered the regional consensus of stability above all. Iran thought the Strait of Hormuz was a hostage lever, a way to force the world to negotiate. Instead, it was a catalyst for a regional breakup. By forcing the UAE to abandon the stability consensus, Iran actually accelerated a massive production race among its neighbors. This makes Iranian oil, heavily sanctioned and choked off, increasingly irrelevant. To stay afloat, Iran has been forced to turn to the shadow fleet. We are talking about hundreds of ghost tankers, performing ship-to-ship transfers in the dead of the Indian Ocean, turning off their tracking transponders, and blending sanctioned oil into the global supply chain as neutral product. It is a high-stakes, low-margin game of hide-and-seek. They burned their own house down to keep the lights on, only to find the fire drove their neighbors into the cold, leaving Iran alone in the dark. You cannot discuss this collapse without mentioning the bonyads. These aren't just religious foundations. They are an economic black hole, controlling nearly 30% of Iran's entire GDP. They operate outside the tax code, outside the law, and outside the reach of the civilian economy. When the rial dies, the bonyads don't blink. Because they control the supply chain, from raw steel to transport logistics, they operate in hard currency and barter. They are the shadow state. They don't need a healthy national economy because they have already decoupled from it. They have created a closed-loop system where they thrive while the public sector withers. This is why the regime can continue to launch drones while families can't afford bread. The fortress is fully funded, even as the people starve. The timer on the Iranian Fortress isn't set by drones or sanctions. It is set by the physical exhaustion of the country's infrastructure. They have successfully built a fortress, but they are rapidly running out of a nation to govern. The final act of this pivot isn't a military collapse. It's the day the lights stay off for everyone, including those inside the fortress walls. The data suggests we are approaching the final terminal stages of this pivot. But what happens to the global energy market when the fortress finally runs out of fuel? We've established the why of this collapse. In our next episode, we are mapping the shadow fleet, the literal tankers moving this oil. to see if the math of this fortress actually adds up. If you want the full data set on the coming regional shift, hit subscribe. We are Cove.